Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 8, our last week here together. It's hard to believe that it is now over. This week, we're going to be completing chapter 17 and 18. And the items due this week include the Learn Smart chapters 17 and 18, a free and informed consent blog, sexual consent wiki, sexual harassment versus flirting assignment, violence versus sexually explicit material wiki, Chapter 17 and 18 quiz, and your issue paper is due this week, and finally your discussion board. So just a reminder for the issue paper. When you turn in your final paper, make sure you have at least 4 pages. This does not include the title and reference page. That you have at least 5 references, with 4 of them being from peer-reviewed journals. That you are citing your sources within the document using APA. You also have an APA reference page. Check your spelling and grammar. And finally, make sure your paper is double spaced. Also, make sure you're using Times New York font, size 12. So first, we're going to talk about sexual assault and sexual misconduct. In a study of sexually aggressive behavior and its consequences, essentially, earlier researchers only focused on rape, which is defined as penile vaginal penetration performed against a woman's will through the use of force or threat of force. However, contemporary, more modern research focus on a much broader range of sexually related behaviors against another person, regardless of sex and gender. Non-consensual sexual contact involves sexual penetration, sexual touching, sexual harassment, and stalking. So sexual harassment refers to 2 different types of behaviors. One is abuse of power for sexual ends, and the second is creating a hostile environment. Only a person with power can really commit the first kind of harassment. What I mean by that is only a person in power can abuse that power for sexual ends. The second kind, however, hostile environment, is created when someone acts in sexual ways that interferes with a person's performance at work or school. Now, this one does not have to be performed by a person in power. This can be really by anyone in the workplace or school that creates a hostile environment. So what is sexual harassment? The guidelines from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission defines it as any unwanted sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other conduct with one of the following: that there is an explicit or implicit, that it explicitly or implicitly affects a person's employment. Explicit means it's very obvious, but implicit means it's not as obvious. And second, that it creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. Now, examples of sexual harassment include verbal harassing or abusing someone, putting subtle pressures for sexual activity, making remarks about a person's clothing, body, or sexual activities, leering or oogling at a person's body, engaging in unwelcome touching, patting, or pinching, brushing up against another person's body, making demands for sexual favors, and physically assaulting someone. Another form of sexual harassment could be masturbating in front of an unsuspecting person. That is also considered sexual harassment. Sexual harassment, unfortunately, commonly occurs in schools, the workplace, as well as other settings. Another form of sexual harassment is called stalking. And may not be as explicit sexually, so not as obvious sexually. But examples include being watched or followed, being repeatedly contacted, or being threatened by physical harm. And here's a chart of stalking tactics against American men and women who reported being stalked in their lifetime. You can see here the vast majority have experienced unwanted messages, including text and voice, or unwanted phone calls. It's almost 80% of women and 72% of men. Another thing you'll notice from this chart is that while it seems women do experience sexual harassment at rates higher than men, men do experience sexual harassment and being stalked. And so it's important to recognize that this occurs to both genders. So other examples are being threatened with physical harm at 68 and 70%. And that's 70% against men. So women or men are threatening men with physical harm. Damaged personal property is also pretty high on the scale, as well as for women being approached or showing up at places that they know their woman will be at, or being watched or followed. So then it's important to recognize that flirtation and sex and harassment are very different behaviors. And that is one of the assignments this week, just to help clarify what those behaviors are and how they are different. Flirtation is ambiguous, it's goal oriented behavior with potential sexual or romantic overtones. But whether it's considered flirtation or sexual harassment depends on three factors. One is whether you have equal power, whether you are approached appropriately, and whether you wish to continue contact. And then culture, gender, and power differentials complicate this issue. So when you think about harassment in school and college, I do believe it's getting better, but there is sort of this culture of harassment, especially in the younger grades, grade school, where this idea of boys teasing girls is this time-honored practice in elementary and high school. Other examples are name calling, spreading sexual gossip. When it's defined as teasing, the impact is discounted. And what I mean by that is it means when it's just teasing that there is no impact, that just get over it, right? Whereas if it's harassment, then I think the school takes it a little more seriously. But the same behavior can be attributed as teasing or a sexual harassment. Among middle and secondary school students, sexual harassment occurs more often when boys are within a group of their peers. And unfortunately, sometimes it's ignored by adults, or they just label boys will be boys and move on and get over it. There is also a culture of sexual harassment on college and university campuses. Nearly 50% of students report being the victims of sexual harassment since enrolling in school. And there are two major issues or problems when dealing with sexual harassment in college. So, one are gender differences in levels of tolerance. And even amongst genders, some people have high levels of tolerance, some people have lower levels of tolerance. And then the attribution of blame, with women often blamed for not taking a compliment and for provoking unwanted sexual attention, right? So she was asking for it because she dressed a certain way, or it wasn't harassment, it was just a compliment and she's just being too sensitive. And so there's often this culture of victim blaming. And the same goes in the workplace, but issues of sexual harassment in the workplace are also very complicated because it's an important place for adults to meet potential partners in life. And despite media attention, allegations of harassment against famous men led to very little changes in how the culture addressed the issue. I do think it's changing, but I think it has been very slow to catch up. And so there is this, line again between flirtation and harassment, and it's that line that's very problematic, especially for men. Many women often do not realize that they were being harassed until later. And then in 2017, allegations against Harvey Weinstein led to this landslide of sexual harassment accusations and admissions and the firing or resignation of many powerful figures in Hollywood. And I think that this began the conversation again and began more work towards reducing and potentially eliminating harassment in the workplace. There's also been a lot of sharing and healing that began with social media with the media hashtag, the Me Too movement. And other industries in US Congress also began to tackle this long, buried issue. So it tends to be more pervasive or popular or common in male dominated occupations. And it is used as a way to exert control and dominance in the workplace. And so while it does have sexual undertones, underneath that, the prevailing purpose of it is to exert dominance of power. And so in most sexual harassment situations, men are harassing women, but men can also be the victims. And harassment can have a variety of consequences for the victim, as you can imagine. This includes depression, anxiety, shame, humiliation, and anger. There's also gender-based harassment in public spaces. One example is the cases of street harassment or sexual harassment in public places. Gender-based street harassment is unwanted attention that's forced on a stranger in a public place, obviously without their consent. And it's because of their actual or perceived sex or gender expression or sexual orientation. I think of these as the catcalling of women or of men in the street. Research has also shown that persons of color and those who identify as LGBTQIA are disproportionately impacted by street harassment. And because it's something that occurs between strangers, there is generally really difficult to get legal recourse. And then we also need to talk about harassment and discrimination against gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. So heterosexual bias is the tendency to see the world from a heterosexual lens and assuming that everyone is heterosexual. And by doing that, it really ignores or devalues homosexuality and other types of sexualities. Other terms used to describe this include heterosexism or heterocentric behavior. It tends to be widely accepted in society, media, and the family. It ignores the existence of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And it also segregates these populations from heterosexual people. And it subsumes gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people into a larger category. But think about TV shows. I do think it's becoming a little more common to include gay, bisexual, lesbian people. However, I don't know of any shows that include transgender people. And then there's this anti-gay prejudice, which is a strong dislike or fear, hatred of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people because of their sexual attraction or the sexual orientation. Now, homophobia is specifically an irrational or phobic fear, whereas prejudice justifies discrimination. So it takes it one step further. LGBTQIA people are often discriminated against in housing and employment opportunities, adoption of children, and parental rights. These people may also be harassed and bullied and become victims of physical violence as a result of their sexual orientation. And it really influences, how people feel about themselves, and often results in feeling as they're not part of society or outside of society. And so there are some anti-gay prejudice and anti-discrimination laws. Education and positive social advocacy and interactions are really important to combat prejudice. Another way is to create legislation to guarantee gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender individual equal protection under the law. And a significant legal advance was lifting of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which banned openly gay military members. So this policy stated you can be gay and serve in the military, but you can't say that you're gay. So don't ask, don't tell. By lifting this policy, it allowed people to be openly gay and serve in the military. However, in 2017 and 18, President Trump issued directives banning most transgender individuals from serving. And then we're going to talk a little bit about sexual assault. So this is an act of violence and aggression that forces its survivor into an intimate physical encounter against his or her will. The principal motive is generally power. It's not generally sexual gratification. And survivor experiences terror, not pleasure. And unfortunately, sexual assault is a fact of life for women, especially young ethnic and minority women, but rarely for men. While men are assaulted, have been assaulted, it is most often conducted by other men. And states have been trying to replace the term rape and sodomy with more gender neutral terms such as sexual assault or criminal sexual conduct, regardless of the survivor's sex or gender. Male rape survivors also will suffer from fears that are similar to those felt by women or female rape survivors, including the belief that somehow they enjoyed it or somehow contributed or consented to the act of rape. And there is considerable sexual assault in gay and lesbian relationships. Other terms related to this are statutory rape, which is consensual sexual contact with a person younger than the state's age of consent. Each state has different ages for their consent. In Illinois, it is 17. In some states, factors such as age differences also play a role. So, for example, Illinois does not have this law, but for example, in other states, let's say the age of consent is 17 and a 17-year-old has sex with a 16-year-old. Well, the state would then say if it's within a year of the age, then they're not going to prosecute based on statutory rape terms. And so that's what the factors such as age difference would look like. Enforcement is generally very sporadic or arbitrary. There's no rhyme or reason who gets criminally sanctioned or criminally arrested and who doesn't. And then there's marital rape, which is unwanted sexual behavior by a spouse or ex-spouse committed without consent. So it's against a person's will, and done by force, intimidation, or when a person is not able to consent. I think that this term should just be called rape, that you don't really need to define it as marital rape, because somehow putting the term marital in front of the term rape makes it seem okay or less bad. And so I think that they should just use the term rape to define this. And then there's campus sexual assaults. 1 in 5 women report being sexually assaulted or raped while in college. And it is believed that many more rapes occur than what are reported. Because this college culture tends to fuel sexual assault, perpetrators often prey on those who are perceived as vulnerable, oftentimes those that are under the influence of drugs and or alcohol. The majority of survivors are assaulted at parties by someone they know. And men who believe in the rape myth are more likely to see alcohol consumption as a sign of sexual availability. And so what this means is that men view women who drink as wanting to have sex. And so the women are drinking alcohol to show that they are ready to have sex. And then just confusion over sexual consent plays a major role too. So there are 4 meanings of consent that have been suggested: that it's an internal state of willingness, it's explicitly agreeing to do something. And so by explicit meaning that you are verbally saying, yes, I want to engage in sex. There is no ambiguity. It's consent as behavior that someone else interprets as willingness, although that's very difficult, and consent as distinct from wanting. And so states have really been pushing this idea of getting affirmative consent. And this is a standard that requires individuals trying to initiate sexual activity to get the other person's consent before proceeding to sex. And silence or lack of resistance cannot be interpreted as consent, and non-consent must be assumed. So the standard now is non-consent is assumed, and someone must give you consent to engage in sex. So in state-funded California colleges and elsewhere, the traditional no means no has been taken out, and it's replaced with yes means yes. And so again, before the standard was almost like everyone wanted that wanting sex was the standard, and so then you'd have to say no if you didn't want sex. So now it's the opposite, that wanting sex is not the standard. Actually, the standard is no, but you would have to give affirmative consent to show that you want to have sex. So the burden now is obtaining a yes instead of having someone say no. And a lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent. Affirmative consent is ongoing and can be withdrawn at any time. And intoxication cannot be an alibi. So you can't say, well, I was drunk and that's why I had sex. So critics often argue that these policies are too vague and they're impractical and they're really difficult to prove legally. And I think that that's just going to happen regardless. I don't know how to make the policies more clear and how to make them more practical in terms of in the court of law. Post-refusal sexual persistence. So men are more likely to think that Male-female relationships are a battle of the sexes and see refusals as accepted part of that battle. So post-refusal sexual persistence is continually persisting to have sexual contact even after the person has continually refused. And so in this example, if someone continues to ask for sex or dates and the answer is no, 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 just by being so um, persuasive and so persistent, that itself can be seen as sexually coercive. And then the aftermath of rape. So 90% of rape survivors report some type of physical injury. Male, female, anyone who has been raped can develop post-traumatic stress disorder. This includes feeling anxiety, depression, restlessness, and guilt, and then also concerns about their own physical safety. Women, generally more than men, experience physical symptoms such as asthma, irritable bowel syndrome, frequent headaches, chronic pain, difficulty sleeping, and limitations of their activities. Survivors are also more likely to develop a mental disorder as a result of the rape. And then child sexual abuse is any sexual related activity between an adult and a child or any minor. It's not limited to penetration, force and pain or touching, and it involves an adult engaging in any sexual behavior with a minor. Um, a growing and serious trend, though, is the making and downloading of sexual images of children on the internet. And viewing these images is also considered that you are participating in the abuse. So, viewing images of child pornography, you are just as guilty in the eyes of the law. And so, treatment and prevention of child sexual abuse. So, for survivors of child sexual abuse, adequate support and therapy approaches, including cognitive and behavioral therapy, is vital. Sex abusers also need treatment, and programs that focus on prevention include group instruction in school, programs to educate professionals who works with children to look for signs and warning signs of sexual abuse, um, and teaching children, here are your private parts, here's where no one else should touch, what to do if they think that someone has touched them inappropriately, and those sorts of ideas. So Morgan's Law was enacted in 1995 and upheld by the Supreme Court in 1997. And this requires law enforcement authorities to make information about registered sex offenders available to the public. For high-risk sex offenders, this includes door-to-door notification. And so police officers or community service officers go door to door to tell the neighbors that there is a high-risk sex offender in the neighborhood. Sex offenders must also register with local authorities when they move locations. And most states and many communities have laws that place numerous restrictions on sex offenders. And all states have internet registries. There are constitutional issues, however. So imagine a high-risk sex offender moves into your neighborhood and you have a police officer that comes to the door to tell you that you have a high-risk sex offender, who they are, and where they live. It creates off the bat a notion, no one wants a sex offender in their neighborhood. And so then people tend to react and conduct behaviors to get that person to move out. And so it becomes a really difficult situation. All right, we're going to move on to the next chapter, which is sexually explicit materials, sex workers, and sex laws. So sexually explicit materials are really difficult to study objectively because they trigger deep and conflicting feelings about sexuality. And the difficult area is what distinguishes images of erotica or pornography. So erotica, which is from the Greek word for love poem, and it's a sexually explicit material that can be evaluated positively, often involving mutuality, respect, affection, a balance of power, and may be considered artistic. And so erotic images tend to have nudity, and may involve sex, but the viewer sees it from a positive light. Pornography is also sexually explicit material, but this may be evaluated negatively and might include anything that depicts sexuality and causes sexual arousal in the viewer. But as you can see, these two words are very similar. And if you looked at a pornography picture or a picture or an erotic picture, I mean, sometimes they might look exactly the same. It really depends on how the viewer takes and interprets the image. So sexually explicit materials are legal in the US, but materials that are obscene are not legal. And what is obscene? So it comes from the Latin word for filth, and it implies a personal or societal judgment that something is offensive. We also have sexually explicit material, which materials whose primary themes, topics, or depictions involve sexuality that may cause sexual arousal. And then these sexually explicit videos and films, which are called pornography, are widely consumed in the United States. So SEM stands for sexually explicit material, and there are various types and themes. There could be erotic stories, phone apps related to sex, sexually explicit magazines, sending and receiving nude or semi-nude photos, watching sexually explicit videos. About one-third of US college students reported viewing sexually explicit videos in the past 30 days. And the reasons have not really thoroughly been studied, or what are the motivations for watching pornography or explicit videos. Many mainstream sexually explicit videos target male heterosexuals and portray the stereotypical male idea of sexuality. And so research shows that the vast majority of activities in pornography are depicted as consensual. They do portray differing levels of objectification, power, and violence, but consensuality is the central theme. Criticisms include that there is too little focus on relationship and emotional intimacy, and that content reinforces unhealthy or unrealistic images of sexuality. There is a different genre of pornography that's called femporn, and these are pornography videos that uh, have feminist values. They tend to be less male centered and more reflective of women's erotic fantasy. So, more about the emotional attachment and romantic. I think of Bridgerton as an example of femme pornography. And then gay and lesbian sexually explicit films differ somewhat. Gay porn tends to focus on the eroticism of the male body and male nudity, whereas lesbian explicit films usually depict realistic sexual interactions with a wide range of body types and both butch and femme styles. And sex between men is rarely shown in heterosexual films. However, sex between women is sometimes shown during heterosexual films. So, what are the effects of these films? So, people who view sexually explicit videos recognize it as fantasy. There is a personal disposition likely that plays a larger role in what a person's sexual behavioral patterns and experimentation levels are. But general reasons for viewing sexually explicit videos include arousal of sexual sensation, they do it for information, and enjoyment of safer sex. And in fact, therapists may recommend the use of sexually explicit videos to women who experience low sexual desire and sexual arousal. In the same notion, men are also cautioned not to try to imitate what they see in pornography in terms of power and sexual objectification. Child pornography is a form of child sexual exploitation. Many children exploited this way exhibit distress, poor adjustment, suffer from depression, anxiety, and guilt, and may become destructive and antisocial. Children's sexting has contributed to what some call this golden age of pornography. And so there are predators out there on the internet that target children on the internet and get them to send naked or explicit images of themselves. Laws governing obscenity and child pornography apply to all of these, especially sexting. And child pornography has been found to be patently offensive and not within the zone of free speech. And so, therefore, we must talk about censorship. So, to censor means to examine in order to suppress or delete anything considered objectionable. And censorship occurs when the government, private groups, or individuals impose their moral or political values on others by suppressing words, ideas, or images they deem offensive. And currently, censorship continues to flourish at state and local levels in schools and libraries. And again, the purpose of censorship is to suppress words, ideas, or images that are offensive. Now, in terms of pornography, even this can be argued that it's harmful to censor pornography, as long as everything is consensual and legal and all of that. That pornography is the expression of words, ideas, and images. And so, to determine what is obscene, there has been a set of criteria, although these are very subjective. The dominant theme must appeal to prurient sexual interest and portray sexual conduct in a patently offensive way. Taken as a whole, it must be without serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And reasonable people must find it to possess no social value. So as you can see, this criteria are very highly subjective. It would be very difficult um, to put into a rubric of some sort. The other thing we need to talk about are sex work and sex trafficking. So prostitution, as they say, is the oldest profession, but it's the exchange of sexual behaviors for money and or goods, pejorative. More recently, the term sex worker and commercial sex worker have been used by sex industry workers. Sex work occurs in a variety of types. Women are selling sex to men is the most common form of sex work, followed by male sex workers who make themselves available to men. And then there's sex trafficking, which is a growing international market of child and teenage sex slaves that have been fueled the economies of some developing countries. So there is a prevailing notion of sex work around the world. Childhood victimization is a likely background factor for both girls and boys who enter into sex work. Many women begin working as sex workers in their younger years, even in the early teens. Girls are often introduced into sex work by pimps upon whom they become emotionally and financially dependent on. Adolescent sex workers are often runaways who have engaged in sexual risk behaviors. Often involved women are frequently abused by their pimps and run the risk of abuse from customers. Sex workers are aware of the psychological and physical costs of sex work, but their sense of self-worth may not be directly attributable to their work. And then there's the streetwalkers. And these are sex workers who solicit customers on the street. They are especially vulnerable to violence and are considered the highest risk of sex workers. Forms of female sex work. So streetwalkers constitute about only 10% of sex workers in the United States. They're more visible, they're more likely to be arrested, more likely to be beaten, robbed, or raped, suffer from more occupational hazards, and also have less control over their work. The work in brothels has a higher status and is generally considered safer. Most today have been replaced by massage parlors where the intent is disguise, and call girls have the highest status of all sex workers. In terms of male sex workers, most research under these focus on street hustlers, the male equivalent of streetwalkers. Other types include call boys, rent boys, masseurs, sex workers who work out of gay bars, and they're also called kept boys. The minority are gigolos, and these are heterosexual men who provide sexual services for women in exchange for money. The overwhelming majority of male sex workers sell their services to other males, and most identify as gay or bisexual. Most males are introduced into sex work through the influence of their peers and the promise of easy money. Some gay male sex workers engage in prostitution as a way to express their sexuality and to make money. Male sex workers and male clients typically use protection to protect themselves from HIV and STIs. And there's been very little research on transgender sex workers. So sex workers in the law. So female sex work is extensively prosecuted, and the male patron is seldomly arrested. Solicitation is a word, gesture, action that implies an offer of sex for sale. And there are those who favor and those who oppose the decriminalization and or legalization of sex work. Some say that if we legalize it, it makes it a safer industry, while others who say if we legalize it, it's going to place more women into the role of sex work, which is harmful to their physical and emotional health. But whatever one stance is, the treating juvenile prostitutes as delinquents overlooks the fact that juvenile prostitutes are victims. So, for several reasons, female male transgender prostitutes are at higher risk for STI and HIV/AIDS. Many also use injection drugs. They have numerous partners. They do not always require their partners to use condoms. Male sex workers engage in high risk sexual practices, especially anal intercourse, which is a high risk for both the worker and the clientele. The Joint United Nations Program on AIDS notes that sex workers face barriers in HIV prevention due to the criminalization of sex work and the numerous restrictions placed on sex work. This concludes our PowerPoint for this week in our presentation. Have a wonderful week, and let's end on a strong note.